Seen the principal arteries of the brain, we'll move on to look at its veins and at the channels that its veins drain into, the venous sinuses.
The brain is richly covered with veins. Over the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, the veins emerge from the sulci, join with one another, and run upwards within the arachnoid layer. Here, behind the midbrain, veins converge from many directions to form this great cerebral vein. We'll see where that goes shortly.
These veins drain into the venous sinuses, which are a special feature of the cranial cavity. We'll look at these next. The sinuses that drain almost all the blood from the brain are the two sagittal sinuses, the straight sinus, and the two transverse sinuses. These sinuses are closely related to the major folds in the dura that we saw in an earlier section, the falx and the tentorium.
In this specimen, there are some openings in the falx, which is not unusual. The two sagittal sinuses run the length of the falx. The smaller inferior sagittal sinus runs within its free border. The larger superior sagittal sinus runs within its attached border. Blood in both the sagittal sinus flows from front to back. Here, we've removed one side of the superior sagittal sinus so that we can look into it. As we saw in a previous section, the superior sagittal sinus is contained in a triangular space that's enclosed on all three sides by dura. At several places, side passages called lacunae open into the sinus. Veins from the surface of the brain open into the lacunae. The superior sagittal sinus ends where the attachments of the falx and the tentorium meet. Also running toward the same point is the straight sinus, which we'll lay open. The straight sinus runs along the junction between the falx and the tentorium. At its upper end, it receives the inferior sagittal sinus and also the great cerebral vein.
Here, there's a major joining and branching of sinuses called the confluence of sinuses.
We'll look at it in a different dissection of just the back of the head. The confluence of the sinuses is here. To see it, we'll remove the falx and the tentorium, leaving just their lines of attachment. Here's the confluence laid open. Leading from it on each side are the two major outflow channels for venous blood, the transverse sinuses. Each transverse sinus runs within the attached border of the tentorium. Starting here in the midline, the transverse sinus follows the attachment of the tentorium round to here, then continues by turning sharply downwards in this S-shaped groove just behind the petrous temporal bone. The sinus goes by two different names. This part is the transverse sinus, this part is the sigmoid sinus. To follow the sigmoid sinus, we'll look at a different skull. Here's the groove for the right sigmoid sinus. Here's the groove for the left one. They're usually unequal in size. The sigmoid sinus leaves the cranial cavity by passing through this irregular opening, the jugular foramen, along with three cranial nerves that we saw in the previous section. Here we're looking into the posterior cranial fossa from behind. The cerebellum has been removed. We'll remove the dura that covers the sigmoid sinus. Within the jugular foramen, the end of the sigmoid sinus turns sharply downwards, becoming continuous with the internal jugular vein.
As we'll see in a minute, there are also venous sinuses that drain the base of the skull. Before we see them, we need to go back to the superior sagittal sinus and look at the structures on each side of it that absorb cerebrospinal fluid. These structures, the arachnoid granulations, were left out of the picture in the earlier section on the brain. To see them, we'll return to this view of the surface of the brain.
This central strip of dura contains the superior sagittal sinus. We'll remove the dura that forms the roof of the sinus. These small projections in the floor of the sinus and on its sides are arachnoid granulations. They're upward protrusions of the arachnoid membrane. At their surface, cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space is transferred back into the bloodstream.
Now we'll complete our picture of the venous sinuses by looking at the ones that drain the base of the skull. The most important of these are the two cavernous sinuses, one on each side. We saw this view of the cavernous sinus when we looked at the internal carotid artery.
The cavernous sinus is the space around the artery. It extends forward to the superior orbital fissure and backwards almost to the dorsum celli. It's bounded medially by the dura that lines the pituitary fossa. As we've seen, the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus contains these three cranial nerves, the third, fourth, and sixth. Outside these lies the trigeminal ganglion, and outside that, the dura of the middle cranial fossa. To get a cross-sectional view of the cavernous sinus, we'll go to a different specimen and divide it in the frontal plane along this line. This is the cavernous sinus. The big cavity in the midline is a sinus of a different order. It's the sphenoid sinus. Here's the divided internal carotid artery passing forwards. Here are cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. Here's the trigeminal ganglion. Here's the dura. Here's the pituitary gland, contained within the dura that creates the pituitary fossa. The two cavernous sinuses are connected to each other behind the pituitary gland. The cavernous sinus receives blood from several sources, including the superior orbital vein, a major vein from the orbit that connects the cavernous sinus to veins in the upper part of the face. The cavernous sinus drains into the two petrosal sinuses, superior and inferior, which have been exposed on the right side. The petrosal sinuses also receive veins from the cerebellum. They empty into the sigmoid sinus, up here and under here.
Now we've finished looking at the intracranial blood vessels. We'll follow the internal jugular vein in a few minutes.